Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Goodness. Topsy-turvy in Syria. The world watched in surprise by the spectacular fall of the Syrian dictator who was in power for 14 years. The speedy advance of an opposition alliance superheaded by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, northern Syria-based Sunni Islamist insurgent groups that evolved from Nusrat Front, al-Qaeda's former branch in Syria. Russia confirms granting asylum to the overthrown Syrian president al-Assad. It is believed a decision to grant asylum was a personal decision of Russian President Vladimir Putin. It is believed al-Assad was allegedly evacuated by a Russian plane from the Russian airbase at Latakia, the fifth largest city in Syria. Israeli forces have carried out large-scale attacks across Syria, and even today that continues, targeting three major airports and other strategic military infrastructure and military arms, including in the capital of Damascus. Toppled Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's Prime Minister says he has agreed to hand the power to the opposition-led Salvation government headed by Mohammed al-Bashir. So the new government is in the middle of forming and norming. Western governments are very skeptical about how this is going to turn out. So there are many discussions and very watchdogs are watching very closely how things will unfold in Syria. Swiss government says the Secretariat is suspending asylum procedures and decisions for asylum seekers from Syria with immediate effect until the situation can be reassessed. Fair enough. So how did it all start? Fighting between Hezbollah and Israeli forces in neighboring Lebanon leads to a tremendous setbacks for Hezbollah, which in October pulls back fighters from Syria to enforce its front lines. A fragile ceasefire agreement on November 26 leaves Hezbollah with limited room to maneuver. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the leading rebel force, launches a new offensive. Within days, the group enters Al-Posor's city center, and in November, government forces further withdraw from the city. After several days of clashes just outside Hama, the government forces withdrew and takes control of the city. HDS takes control of Dar and Homs, effectively isolating Damascus, the capital of Syria. Rebel forces enter Damascus hours later as reports surface that Assad had left. It's time to look at the key junctures in the Syrian history. After Syria gained its independence from France in 1946, political life in the country was highly unstable, owing in large measure to intense friction between the country's social, religious, and political groups. In 1970, Syria came under the authorization rule of late former president Hafez al-Assad, who is the father of the now overthrown president, whose foremost goals included achieving national security and domestic stability and recovering Syrian territory lost to Israel in 1967. Assad committed his country to an enormous arms buildup, which put several strains on the national budget, leaving little for development. Now, the flavor of the civil war is in the air. A wave of pro-democracy protests and uprisings which began in Tunisia and Egypt toppled their regimes, inspired similar attempts in other Arab countries, including Syria. Not every country saw success in the protest movement. Demonstrators expressing their political and economic grievances were often met with violent crackdowns by their country's security forces. Syria in particular. Between 2006 to 2010, Syria suffered its worst drought in the modern history. Hundreds of thousands of farming families were reduced to poverty, causing a mass migration of rural people to urban shanty towns. The combined efforts of the drought and pre-existing economic disparities under the Assad regime contributed to the first non-violent pro-reform protests in 2011. threatening the rule of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Although Sunni Muslims were predominant among the protesters early on, sectarian division was not initially rigid in somewhat diverse and secular country. It eventually played a significant role, with the ruling Assad family being Alawite and other religious minorities growing concerned about Sunni fundamentalist groups that emerged among the rebels. Alawites also dominated the security forces and irregular militias that carried out some of the worst violence against protesters and suspected opponents of the regime. Sectarian divisions were initially not as rigid as it's sometimes supposed to, though. The political and economic elite was ties to the regime included members of the Syria's confessional groups, not just Alawites, while many middle and working class Alawites did not particularly benefit from belonging to the same community as Assad family and may have shared some of the protesters' strong socio-economic grievances. Like any other country, average citizens fall into the hands of the system, which manipulates to keep the goal of the ruler alive. Assad sought to portray the opposition as Sunni Islamic extremists in the mold of Al-Qaeda and as participants in foreign conspiracies against Syria. The regime also produced propaganda stoking minority fears that the predominantly Sunni opposition would carry out violent reprisals against non-Sunni communities. At one point, uprising turned from a predominantly peaceful protest movement into a militarized rebellion. As the protests increased in strength and size, the regime responded with heavier force and cutting off utilities and communication. Some groups of protesters began to take up arms against the security forces. Escalation to the civil war. His violent suppression of protests escalated into the Syrian civil war between Assad's forces and opposition militias. Protesters demanded an end to the authoritarian practices of Assad regime, in place since Assad's father became the president in 1971. The Syrian civil war has been a source of significant instability in the Middle East since 2011, and the resultant civilian displacement and the refugee migration constitute one of the worst humanitarian crises in the modern history. Having had little success in creating peace between the combatants themselves, the UN and the Arab League sought to enlist the international powers in support of the political settlement to the conflict. In June 2012, an international conference organized by the UN produced the Geneva Communique, which provided a roadmap for negotiation to establish a traditional governing body for Syria, and a transitional one as well. The United States and Russia were unable to agree on which Assad would be included in the future Syrian government, though so that this was left unspecified. It was evident throughout the history, the Secretary General of the United Nations stating that Syria has repeatedly failed to adhere to the terms of the UN peace plan, and that both government and the opposition forces have been responsible for breaching the ceasefire. In 2023, the Arab League votes to reinstate the Syrian government. After the government succeeded in holding control of most of Syria for 3 years, Arab leaders seek to normalize relations and cooperate with Syria on international matters, including the return of the Syrian refugees. So what kind of a leader was son Assad? Although a variety of long-standing political and economic problems pushed the country towards instability, when Assad succeeded his father in 2000, he came to the presidency with a reputation as a modernizer and a reformer. The hopes that were raised by Assad's presidency went largely unfulfilled. In politics, a brief turn towards greater participation was quickly reversed, and Assad revived the authorization tactics of his late father's administration, including pervasive censorship and surveillance and brutal violence against suspected opponents of the regime. Assad also oversaw significant liberation of Syria's state-dominated economy. But those changes mostly served to enrich a network of buddy industrialists who ties into the regime. Ousted Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad deployed chemical weapons on his own people throughout the country's brutal civil war, to the outrage and the horror of the international community. And I was able to see today there has been 100,000 bodies that have been recovered from a mass grave, and these people may have been believed to have been killed during his time. Who were the main international supporters of the Syrian government? Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah are the main international supporters of the Syrian government, providing military and strategic support throughout the conflict. The world view on the past and the present situation in Syria. In 2011, Syria's regional neighbors and the global powers had both begun to split into pro- and anti-Assad camps. The United States and the European Union were increasingly critical of Assad. An anti-Assad bloc consisting of Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia formed in 2011. The United States and EU and the Arab League soon introduced sanctions targeting senior members of the Assad regime. In 2012, Russia and China vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution that condemns the Assad regime's violence crackdown and calls for a transition to a democratic political system in Syria. Chinese and Russian officials say that the resolution places excessive pressure on the Syrian government, decreasing the likelihood of a political settlement. To this day, the United States maintained no formal diplomatic relations with the government of embattled President Bashar al-Assad. But it does back the Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish-led coalition based largely in the northeast, an ally in defeating ISIS. President-elect Trump responds with the following message on social media: "Syria is a mess, but it is not our friend." He emphasized that uppercase letter, the United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. It is actually going to be interesting to watch this space starting 2025 when he assumes office. While Dave Hardin, the former senior advisor to the US President Barack Obama's special envoy for Middle East peace, have said the following to news channels: "It's chaotic, dangerous, but there is some hope as well. It is hard to be confidently optimistic about the future of Syria. We must not shut it here at the fall of al-Assad's family, which has been tyrannically ruling Syria for 53 years. But it is not clear what the rise of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham would mean for the country. Global powers were attempting to shape the country's future in ways that cannot be anticipated. Syria is an example of the end of the post-World War II era. And what we are seeing is ancient empires and global powers fighting for the road to Damascus. Israel is one of the players in the mix, along with Iranians, Turks, all battling with Russia and the United States as global powers trying to shape the future of Syria. While Iran has continued to voice support for the overthrown Syrian president, post a meeting held between the foreign ministers of Iran, Russia, and Turkey at a press conference, Iran expressed they stand with Syria against the groups that are without a doubt carrying out an American Zionist conspiracy, has issued stern warnings that fighting in Syria could spread across the region, considering the high level of tension amid Israel's brutal war on Gaza. Tehran has stressed the idea that the rebels are foreign supported in apparent effort to prevent this offensive from being seen as a mere continuation of the civil war in Syria. For Russia, the most important question now is the fate of its military base in Syria, which it hopes to keep. The Syrian opposition leaders have reportedly guaranteed the security of Russian air and naval bases in Latakia and Tartus, as well as the Russian diplomatic mission in the country. More than 13 million Syrians have fled their homes over the country's 14-year war. Mass graves have been getting discovered as we speak today. While 90% of the people who have fled the country are seeking humanitarian assistance. UN's refugee agency says between 800,000 and 1 million people have been displaced inside Syria since the opposition forces launched their offensive to topple al-Assad. This number includes 150,000 experiencing secondary displacement. It said, women and girls comprise nearly half of the figure. The repeated Israeli attacks in and around Damascus and other regions create a huge challenge for the opposition in Syria to preserve the state apparatus and secure smooth transition. Israel said it struck Syria's chemical weapons capabilities and had ordered the creation of a security zone inside Syrian territory. The UN said that the move breached the 1974 agreement. As well, as you all know, the stand that Israel has taken in the recent past with the UN and their relationship has suffered lately. Then this nicely connects with the previous analysis that has been done on the reform and replace the United Nations global governance at a crossroads. Please visit and listen to that video. You'll be able to understand about the future of UN. Now, with the present challenges, what will the future hold for Syria? With that, I will leave you here. Until then, you look after yourself. I will meet you in another episode of Goodness. Thank you.
Why did they let only us go, Mr. Anu?
Because you are tourists, madam. This is the place that King Ravana lived and he is also buried. One day he will wake up and save Sri Lanka.
Like it?
Love it.
There we go. Thank you for spending 5 years of your life with me.
To us.
Mr. Andrew, we got robbed. Where were you?
You sure it's them, Jason?
ആ ജനൽ ശരിക്കും അടച്ചായിരുന്നില്ലേ?
Pend out.
We are not safe here, sir.
Don't go there, sir. They will kill you.
Kill who?
Kill you, me, madam, all.
How can you be so happy, Amma?
You want me to be unhappy?
Do you think when women face problems, they cry and hope for a man to rescue them?
Aren't we also responsible?
How are we responsible for it?
This is human life. Doesn't it have any value? Andrew, now might be a good time for Ravana to wake up from his slumber and save Lanka. Let